Well, Doolittle's plane took off first, was successful in getting off the carrier, and they said that a cheer erupted that it could have been heard back in the United States. And subsequently, the other crew members and the other planes felt a little more confident, and they were also further back on the carrier deck, so they had a little bit more room to work with. My dad was in plane number 7, the Ruptured Duck. His pilot was Ted Lawson, a very good pilot. But apparently the wind was blowing so hard at the time that he put his flaps down when the plane taxied off the carrier deck. It immediately sunk down toward the ocean. He realized his error, released the flaps, and it lifted back up. But that was the first of many, heart-throbbing moments, I guess, for the crew during the raid. Well, they circled around. They got their bearings from a mate on the ship, and then they proceeded to fly single file, not in a formation or anything, toward Japan. It was about 9 o'clock a.m. when Dad's plane took off, and they skimmed the wave tops for the next 3 hours and hit the coast of Japan about noon. It was a Saturday, beautiful sunny day, but they were so close to the ground that they could see the Japanese residents below them. And some of the Japanese looked up, saw the planes. Apparently they looked like some Japanese bombers, and the insignia weren't readily apparent that indicated they were American planes. So the Japanese looked up and were waving at them and, joyous to see their planes going over. Well, they continued on, and their target was the Nippon Shipping Works factory, and they were able to locate that, and when they got over the target, they ascended the plane to about 1,400 or 1,500 feet, then subsequently dropped 4 bombs. 3 of them were 500-pound bombs, and the 4th one had 127 incendiary clusters on it, and as soon as that was released, the clusters just went out all over the place, and once they hit the ground, they started small fires throughout Tokyo. Once they dropped their 4 bombs, the plane turned around, went to the south end of Japan, and then proceeded toward China. It took several more hours for them to reach the coast of China, and as they got closer and closer to China, the weather started to get increasingly bad, and by the time that they were nearing the coast, the visibility was almost near zero. It was just heavy storms, but there had been what they called a divine wind. Apparently, this was pretty an aberration of the weather pattern, but for some reason, divine or whatever reason, they got a strong tailwind that actually pushed the planes over to China, and even though they were running out of gas, all of the planes made it to the coast of China. Several of them were able to fly inland, and the crews parachuted out. Dad's pilot saw an opening in the clouds, looked down, and saw what looked like a beach. And so he circled around, and sure enough it was. And he was intending to make a landing on the beach. They still had about 100 gallons of gas left at the time. And he figured if they could land on the beach, they could take off the next day and then make it further inland to safer areas. So he had his wheels down on the plane, circling around, and then he decides to go in for a landing. Well, the engines suddenly seized up as they were almost to the beach, and they actually hit the waves about a quarter mile out from the beach on the ocean, and the impact of the landing stopped the plane immediately, flipped it upside down, and it caused the 4 other crew members, the pilot, the co-pilot, the navigator, and the bombardier, to be thrown out through the front of the plane. The pilot, the co-pilot, and the navigator were all up in the front part, and the bombardier was down in the nose of the plane. So the first 3 were thrown out through the top of the plane. The bombardier was thrown out through the nose of the plane. Dad, a beneficial aspect of him being the engineer gunner on the plane was in the back, the tail end of the plane. And he had the foresight that morning before they took off to dress in an extra layer of clothing. So when the plane hit, he was in the back of the plane. He said he was thrown around like a pea in a drum, and he was actually knocked out by the impact, but he came to he estimated about 5 minutes later. When he did, he was obviously disoriented. He had a bump on his head, and water was coming in through the tail end section of the plane. And since the plane was upside down, it took him a while to figure out his bearings, but he finally found the escape hatch, climbed out, walked out onto the wing of the plane, and then McClure, the navigator, yelled at him from the beach. The other 4 members of the crew had already washed up on the beach, and they were kind of huddled around. All 4 of them were pretty seriously injured. Ted Lawson, the pilot, had a significant deep gash in his arm that went all the way down to the muscle. He had most of his teeth knocked out, but his worst injury was a slice to his left leg that went down to the bone. Dean Davenport, the co-pilot, had some wounds to his head and pretty deep gashes. Charles McClure, the navigator, dislocated both of his shoulders from the impact, and Robert Clever, the bombardier, when he was thrown out through the nose of the plane, it almost tore his scalp off. So you can imagine, here's 4 of his crewmen who were seriously injured, and Dad hears them moaning, and McClure yells out to him. So he jumped off the wing of the plane into about 6 feet of water. He waded ashore, and he was the only member of the plane that still had his gun belt and his first aid kit, because everybody else there were like 2 of the guys, the pilot and co-pilot, were strapped to their seats when they were thrown out. McClure was thrown out above them, and then Clever was thrown out below them. So, but fortunately, Lawson and Davenport were able to unfasten their seat belts and float to the surface, and then they were washed into the shore. So when Dad gets up there on the beach, he puddles around with him, and he happened to look up, and he saw a group of Asian people off to the left, up above the beach, looking down at them, and he was uncertain whether they were Chinese or Japanese, and he initially asked Lawson, since he had his service weapon with him, whether he should shoot them, and Lawson said no, that he thought they were friendlies. Well, the Chinese subsequently came down to the beach, examined them. Obviously, they couldn't communicate, so the Chinese used sign language and pointed to the fingers on their hands to determine whether or not there were additional crewmen out on the plane. Dad indicated no, there were just the 5 of them. And so after they got through with that little round of negotiations, they helped the 4 injured crew members, and then Dad followed behind, up to the village looking over the beach to a hut. And there were some plywood pallets on the floor of the hut where they were all able to lay down in obviously varying degrees of distress and pain and anguish. They were there for a few hours, and Lawson asked Dad to go out and back to the plane to see if he could find the first aid kit. Actually, prior to this, Dad had used the bandages in his first aid kit and his handkerchief to bind up Lawson's wounds, and then he had to use some dirty rags that the Chinese had to bind up the wounds of the other 3 crewmen. So Dad went out with a couple of Chinese out to check out the wreckage of the plane, but high tide was up at the time, and so he couldn't get out there. So he came back, and a couple hours later, there was a knock on the door, and this imposing Chinese man who was wearing a black raincoat and a big black hat, kind of a coolie hat, appeared at the door. The Chinese who were in the hut with the crew deferred to him because he obviously seemed to be a leader. And he identified himself by the name Charlie. He was able to speak some pidgin English, and the men were able to understand kind of what he was saying. He had actually served on some kind of a commercial type crew prior to the war, and he'd been around some people that could speak English, so he had been able to pick up some basic words. But anyway, Dad and the other members of the crew who were able to talk told him that they needed to be taken inland to a hospital to receive treatment for their wounds.